Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm a bit late for Easter. Apparently last week I was supposed to be going hard on the resurrection in order to be topical.
Every spring, the skeptic's fancy turns to thoughts of Easter, and more specifically trying to debunk the resurrection of Christ.
But I got distracted by a Powell. So this week, to make up for it, I'm covering CMI's Easter video that is supposed to be preempting the atheist content that we always put out at Easter, claiming that the resurrection didn't happen. They also touch on the question of whether or not Jesus existed, and while that can be an interesting discussion by itself, in the context of discussing the resurrection, I have absolutely no problem granting such a mundane claim as a guy with a common name was preaching some fairly common themes at the time and got executed in a fairly common method. So I will start with the assumption that Jesus was a real guy who existed and just skip those parts of the video. Let's go!
And some folks claim that the whole thing was a legend that grew over time, that Jesus was just a good teacher who died and that's it.
I would disagree with the good teacher aspect of it, but quibbling about whether or not his teachings were actually good aside, that is basically my position. Jesus was probably a dude who got a following, his followers were significant enough that he ended up on Rome's radar, or he was teaching things that Rome viewed as potentially rebellious, so he was crucified. His body was likely left on the cross for several days to rot, as that was supposed to be a part of the punishment of crucifixion, and then he was buried in an unmarked grave, possibly a mass grave. Throw in a bereavement hallucination here, an exaggeration there, and boom, we get the resurrected Messiah come to save the world from sin.
Now, of course, Romans weren't in the habit of crucifying people for being good teachers.
Were they not? Maybe I'm wrong, but I was always under the impression that crucifixion was a fairly common punishment for crimes that we today would definitely not consider worthy of the death penalty. But even so, right around the time when Jesus was supposed to have been born, the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus put down a Jewish messianic rebellion by crucifying 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. So if Jesus was teaching messianic things and was thought to actually be the Messiah himself, it stands to reason that Rome would want to do away with him before he would be able to raise an army, given how recently they had to deal with that sort of trouble in the area.
But we need to say that since a robust Christian worldview begins with biblical authority, the Bible is infallible, and therefore the Bible is the most accurate record of the historical events surrounding Easter.
That's right.
And thus we have a nice tidy little circle. As a Christian, I believe the Bible to be infallible. Therefore, the Bible is infallible. Therefore, it's obviously the best record of the things that it records. I'm sorry, but that doesn't fly here.
Yes, and since this is the case, or if you are skeptical of that claim, we could say if the Bible is accurate, then other historical accounts will confirm what the Bible says.
Sure, that would be neat. Unfortunately for you, that's not really what we see. Sometimes it gets place names right, but a lot of the time it's just wrong. Like saying that Quirinius was governor of Syria while Herod the Great was king. Herod the Great died about a decade before Quirinius became governor. Of course, one wrong detail isn't enough for us to discard the book entirely, but by the same virtue, one correct detail does not automatically mean that we can trust the book entirely. And when taken as a whole, it's a bit of a mix-match. It gets some stuff right, and it gets some stuff wrong, and often the things that it gets right or wrong give us some insight into who the author was and what audience they were hoping to reach. For instance, Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience, and so he would often correct details about Jewish culture and tradition that Mark, who was writing to a Roman Christian audience, got wrong.
What about the resurrection? Aren't the Gospels the only books that claim Jesus rose from the dead?
No. There are a number of apocryphal Christian works that make that claim, but modern Christians usually like to ignore these works, except for the occasional oblique reference to the martyrdom of the apostles. But yeah, there aren't any sources that are not religiously motivated to make that claim, unless you're counting the handful of mentions in other sources, the best of which amounts to, here's a group called Christians, and they believe that this Jesus guy was raised from the dead, which isn't really saying much.
Mm-hmm.
And skeptics claim these were written much later, and the resurrection was either made up or based on legends.
That's what they say.
It's not just skeptics that say they were written much later. You'd be hard-pressed to find a legitimate New Testament scholar who thinks that any of the Gospels were written prior to 70 CE, and most New Testament scholars are themselves Christian, so it's not like they're pushing the dates back in an attempt to make the books look less reliable than they actually are.
But why discount the Gospel writers as historians?
Because they weren't historians? Like, literally one of the biggest questions of New Testament scholarship is the question of what genre the Gospels even are, with the conclusion usually being something along the lines of Gospel being a genre that is a subset of biography that is concerned more about getting the subject's message across rather than being historically accurate. As James Dunn and Scott McKnight put it in Volume 10 of the Historical Jesus in Recent Research, it has become much clearer that the Gospels are in fact very similar in types to ancient biographies. That is, their interest was not in the modern one of analyzing the subject's inner life and tracing how an individual's character developed over time. Rather, the ancient view was that character was fixed and unchanging, and the biographer's concern was to portray the chosen subject's character by narrating his words and deeds. Of course, it remains true that the Gospels were never simply biographical, they were propaganda, they were kerygama, preaching.
Is it really because their accounts don't line up with other historical facts?
That is certainly a part of it, yeah.
Or is it an assumption that miraculous things can't happen, so anything supernatural must have been made up?
That's not an assumption. When reconstructing history, it's a game of probability. We know, when reading historical records, that the authors were introducing their biases and beliefs into the record. So for any historical event, we cannot be 100% sure that we have an accurate picture of how it happened in reality. We have to piece it together and figure out which version of events is most likely to have happened based on probabilities. Miracles are, by definition, extremely low probability events. One might even go so far as to say impossible events. So, from an historical perspective, a miracle will never be the most probable explanation for an historical event. This does not mean that historians reject miracles outright, but an honest historian will tell you that even if they believe in the resurrection themselves, it cannot be demonstrated historically using historical methods, because it is definitionally a low to zero probability event.
The Gospels do stand up to scrutiny as historical documents. For example, Luke opened his Gospel account with,
yeah, okay, we all know that Luke started out by pointing out that he was not an eyewitness to the events but was compiling an account based on other accounts. We can skip those verses.
Luke did research.
Yes, he did.
And his details are incredibly accurate.
No, Luke's details are definitely not incredibly accurate. Luke is where we have the conflicting information about Herod the Great being king while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Just because Luke said he was being accurate doesn't mean he was actually accurate. And also, keep in mind that he's stating in these opening verses that he is writing a compilation of what could be found in other sources. So even if he were perfectly accurately representing his original sources, if his sources were historically inaccurate, then he would be as well.
Sir William Mitchell Ramsay was an archaeologist and professor from Oxford and Cambridge universities who at first assumed Luke was mistaken in many areas. But he discovered time and again that Luke was precise about the place names and the many different titles of rulers.
Did you hear that? Syria was a real place. Herod the Great and Quirinius were both real people who really held the offices that Luke said they held. So I guess it doesn't matter that he got the timeline completely wrong. Yes, Quirinius did conduct a census, so I guess he got that right. Guess it doesn't matter that the census of Quirinius was about a decade after Jesus was supposed to have been born, and that the scope of the census was much, much smaller than that reported in Luke, with no census in history ever having the scope that Luke describes. There has also never been a census in history that has required people to travel to the homes of their distant ancestors. That is just a complete historical absurdity. In order to harmonize this, apologists will often claim that the word translated as governor for Quirinius was not the word used to refer to the political office, and so Quirinius must have been appointed as a sort of governor in between Saturninus and Varus in 6 BCE, specifically to conduct the census. Of course, the main problem with that is that Quirinius was occupied by the campaign he was in charge of in Sicilia from 11 BCE to 3 BCE. That's not the only problem by a long shot, but it is the main one. Now, sometimes apologists will also refer to a census taking place in 104 CE in Egypt, which instructed people to return to their homes as precedent for having people return to their ancestral homes for a census. But what they don't say is that in this census they were assessing the people's property in order to determine their taxes. So they're essentially saying that you have to be home on the property that you own in order to participate in the census. Having people return to their ancestral homes where they do not own property would not be conducive to such a census. So all this amounts to, essentially, the author of Luke was trying to emulate the style of historians, but while he did get the style right on occasion, he got the details very, very wrong.
Ramsey concluded, Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians.
And according to F.F. Bruce, a New Testament scholar who advocated for the historical accuracy of the New Testament, Ramsey was so eager to prove Luke to be an accurate historian that he, quote, unwisely damaged his well-founded reputation as a very considerable scholar. That's coming from a man who very much was of the opinion that the Gospels report reliable history.
Okay, and another Oxford historian, Professor A.N. Sherwin-White, has pointed out that creating legends needs a time gap of more than 2 generations.
That is absolutely not what he pointed out. That is the apologetic game of telephone that originates with a misquote of Sherwin-White coming from William Lane Craig. If we go back to what Sherwin-White actually said, it is, Herodotus enables us to test the tempo of myth-making, and the test suggests that even 2 generations are too short a span to allow the mythical tendency to prevail over the hard historic core of the oral tradition. This is not saying that it takes 2 generations for a myth to develop at all, but that it may be too short a span for the myth to completely replace the actual history of the event itself. And the way he made this determination was by comparing writings that had clearly been embellished to more accurate accounts of the same event, and he was only able to find one single example of this in history in the writings of Herodotus. So he was aware of the tentative nature of his conclusion, hence the words like tendency and suggest. I am also of the opinion that he was just wrong. Legends can replace actual historical stories faster than 2 generations, and there are plenty of historians that agree with me.
Luke also wrote the book of Acts, but he doesn't mention Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, being martyred between AD 61 and 65.
He doesn't directly mention those events, no, but he does reference them. So why would he not clearly state that Paul was killed? To quote New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson, it is through attention to Luke's overall narrative interests that we are best able to appreciate this ending not as a result of historical happenstance or editorial ineptitude, but as a deliberately and effectively crafted conclusion to a substantial apologetic argument. Even concerning Paul's fate, Luke has left us with no mystery. By this time, the reader must appreciate that all prophecies spoken in the narrative will reach fulfillment, even if their fulfillment is not recorded in the narrative itself. Thus, the reader knows on the basis of authoritative prophecy that Paul made his defense before Caesar, and knows further that Paul died as witness to the good news of the gift of God because of the prophecies the narrative itself contains to that effect. But the fact that Luke does not find it necessary to tell us these events is a most important clue as to how we should read the conclusion of his work. The point is not the fate of Paul, but the fidelity of God. So, yeah, I guess you guys are just of the opinion that all of the mentions of Paul's future death were just the result of accurate prophecy, but the more plausible scenario is that the author of Luke was able to reference Paul's future death because he was aware that Paul had, in fact, died.
So Acts must have been written before that.
Before that, yeah. He also doesn't refer to the very significant event of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70, and neither does Matthew or Mark. But all 3 tell about Jesus' prediction that the temple would be destroyed.
So, again, what is the more likely scenario here? That they were miraculously contacted by God and given a prediction? Or that they were writing after the fact and so were able to include it as a prophetic detail? And also, keep in mind that this spot in Mark where he predicts the destruction of the temple is the same chapter as when he predicts that the apocalypse will happen before everyone from that generation dies. It's in chapter 13. Given the fact that the apocalypse is a couple thousand years late according to when Jesus predicted it would be, I'm going to go ahead and say that his predictive powers were somewhat limited.
Seems weird they wouldn't mention prophecy that had been fulfilled by the time they wrote, unless, of course, it hadn't yet.
Right.
You're putting the cart before the horse here. This would be like me writing today about how my uncle predicted attacks that would level buildings in New York City back in the 90s, and then people in the future reading these writings and concluding that I must have written them before 2001, because otherwise, why would I not just call them the 9/11 attacks? Well, if I were writing shortly after the attacks, then it would be a pretty safe assumption that everyone would figure out what I was getting at without me having to outright say it, and it's possible that the same is true of the Gospels here. Perhaps they thought it would be needlessly condescending to spell it out for their audiences, especially since the Jewish literary tradition is filled with metaphors and allegories that are meant to be open to interpretation.
Yes.
Now, this indicates those Gospels were written before AD 70.
Nah, man, it literally indicates the opposite, unless you start from a point of assuming that they are a completely reliable source for all of their details, and you're supposed to be presenting information that is ostensibly meant to convince a skeptic here. So we can't start with that if you want to actually, be convincing.
And also affirms Jesus' divinity.
Yes.
I mean, again, if you just uncritically accept it, then I suppose, but one could certainly argue that knowing the future does not automatically make one divine. Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't divinity, when used in relation to Jesus, refer to him being an actual god? Because if so, then telling the future definitely doesn't count for that, because Christianity had many, many prophets who give details about the future. And fun fact, but there are actually books of the Bible that can be dated by pinpointing the spot where the prophecy stopped being accurate. It gets everything right up to a point, and then everything after that point was just completely wrong. So the last event that it got right can be used to figure out when the book itself was written.
Of course, nothing affirms his divinity better than the resurrection itself, which is why skeptics want to refute it.
Again, though, if we're using the divinity to mean that he was a god, no, not unless you want to count all the other people who came back from the dead in the Bible as gods. Praise be to the anonymous zombies of Matthew 27, for truly they are holy. Get it? Because they're zombies, so they'd be like full of holes and stuff?
Sure, yeah. Matthew and Mark could have been written as early as the late 40s or early 50s.
There are no respected scholars that I am aware of that would advocate for such young dates. The consensus among New Testament scholars, who, again, I would like to point out are mostly a bunch of Christians, is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written during the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70 CE, or shortly thereafter, with a general upper range placing it at no later than 80 CE.
And the Gospels aren't the only written accounts of the resurrection. Paul mentions it in 1 Thessalonians around AD 50 and in 1 Corinthians around AD 55.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone would argue with the fact that early Christians believed Christian things like the resurrection. Next up, they read the creed from 1 Corinthians 15. If you're not familiar, basically it's Paul listing people that Jesus supposedly appeared to. It's not original to Paul. He was writing down a creed that had an earlier origin, and nobody knows who originally wrote it or who the 500 witnesses were.
Now, this has been called Christianity's earliest creed, written about 20 years after the resurrection, and there would have been plenty of people around who could have either confirmed or refuted it at that point.
Yeah, sure. Now, how do we know that they didn't? Do we have records from the non-Christians of the time trying to explain these 500 witnesses in terms that make it clear that they actually accepted that they existed in the first place? Do we know that nobody ever asked anyone who recited the creed just who these 500 witnesses were? Do we know that they were actually answered with a list of names? Do we know that anyone ever actually did a checkup on this claim? To say that nobody refuted it is an argument from silence. You just assume that because there are no surviving records of anyone refuting it, that they never existed to begin with. But when a church that was highly motivated to destroy anything they considered to be heretical had near absolute power in that area for about 1,000 years, is it realistic to expect that they wouldn't have destroyed any such writings if they existed? But what about the other witnesses in the creed? Were the witnesses that were actually named made accessible to anyone for cross-examination? Do we have any records from those people themselves saying that they saw a risen Jesus? And this whole thing is just the beginning of the problems with using this creed as a witness testimony.
What if the apostles stole Jesus' body to make it look like Jesus rose from the dead?
I don't think they would have needed to do that, because most likely Jesus was left on the cross to rot for a few days, followed by his interment in an unmarked grave, possibly a mass grave. So the disciples probably didn't even know where his body was by the time it was buried.
Matthew 28, 11 to 15 reads, "While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. When they were assembled with the elders and taken counsel, They gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day.
Yes, passages like that show that Matthew was more concerned with engaging in apologetic discourse than in recording accurate history. This is clearly a, no, the disciples didn't steal the body. That's just what the guards said to stay out of trouble. So Matthew, according to tradition, is an eyewitness to the events that he recorded. So how did he know what transpired between the guard and the chief priests? How could he possibly have known? This suffers from the same problem as the question of who transcribed the private meeting that Jesus had with Pilate. The author seemingly knows things that he could not possibly have known, which I'm sure you'll just mark down in the proof that the Bible is divinely inspired column, since that obviously proves that the only possible explanation is that God told the author exactly what happened, not that he was making up excuses to solve certain problems that he saw.
Now, clearly this story was made up.
Sure.
But what if the disciples had wanted to steal the body?
Jeez, you threw me off there for a second. I honestly thought for a moment that you were referring to the story of the guard asking the chief priest for help covering up a missing body just being entirely made up, because that one clearly is made up. But no, you're talking about the story of a body being stolen. Got excited for a bit there.
Well, they would have had to get past quite a number of Roman soldiers
Yes.
who were certainly not sleeping, since that's punishable by death.
No.
Yeah, they certainly weren't sleeping, since that was punishable by death. So obviously they were completely willing to tell everyone that they were sleeping because the chief priest gave them a bit of money for it. Do you see how that doesn't actually work? There is no way that Roman soldiers would have run to Jewish religious leaders for help with something like this. And to think that they would lie in a way that would leave them open to being executed, likely in the same way as Jesus, since crucifixion was the punishment for disgraced soldiers as well, is just completely laughable. Now, I'm skipping the rest of the stolen body hypothesis. Like I said, I don't think it's the most likely scenario, and they approach it from a perspective of the body snatchers doing everything in a way that would fit with the story of the women discovering the empty tomb, as told by the Bible. But as those four stories can't even get the details straight between each other, I see no reason to just uncritically accept that their details had to have been factual.
Chuck Colson was one of the conspirators in the Watergate scandal. Remember that back in the early 70s? That led to the resignation of President Nixon.
That's the 1970s.
The 1970s, yes. Colson later became a Christian and explained how he came to realize that the resurrection of Christ was true. He said, "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and then they proclaimed that truth for over 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true."
Do we have any records to indicate that those 12 men actually testified that they had really seen Jesus? Yes, we have reports from other people saying that the 12 saw Jesus, but not one of the 12 actually wrote anything themselves that was preserved through time. They disappear from history shortly after the writings of Paul, with no good evidence to support the claim that they kept proclaiming the resurrection for 40 years. And we have a grand total of 0 of them for which there is any reliable evidence that they endured any sort of torture or punishment that they could have avoided by recanting, which kind of takes the air out of the "they would not have endured it if it weren't true" line.
Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible, Colson concludes.
No kidding.
Yeah, and that might give me a bit of pause if we actually had any sort of good evidence to support this 40 years of preaching claim. As it is, we have conflicting accounts that get basic historical and geographical details wrong, and a bunch of letters that are indicative mostly of internal theological squabbling among early Christians.
Yeah.
Not only that, but if I was going to make up a religion, I don't think I'd include things like Peter's denial or the disciples all running away.
Right, yeah.
Why not? The religion is supposed to be all about redemption. Seems to me that including a few redemption arcs in your story of that religion would be a prerequisite for that kind of religion.
And why use women as the first witnesses to the resurrection at a time when a woman's testimony was considered nearly worthless?
Because they weren't testifying in court? Tending to the body was woman's work, so it would have been odd if the men were doing it. As it stands, the first thing the women do is go tell the men, and the men either don't believe it, or they run and verify it for themselves, depending on which book you're reading. Also, depending on the book, the disciples either see him pretty much right away, or else they don't see him until after they have gone to Galilee. Not really relevant to the point here, but I thought I'd take a moment to point out one of the other contradictory bits of the story.
And some of the biggest evidence for the resurrection is the change in the apostles.
So the biggest evidence for the resurrection are details about people that cannot possibly be verified. Fantastic.
Right.
So they all ran away when Jesus was arrested, but then boldly proclaimed his resurrection just a few weeks later.
Did they, though? All that is really needed to start Christianity off is one bereavement hallucination from a single disciple, with Peter being a pretty likely candidate. Word spreads that Peter saw Jesus again, and stories do what stories do when spreading in such a manner, and details start growing around it. Give it a couple decades, and the new sect of Judaism starts growing out of it. But the more traditional sects don't like that, so some of them start persecuting the newer sect, and one of the prolific persecutors has a psychotic break of some kind, has a vision, interprets that vision to have been a messiah figure from this new sect of Judaism that he'd been persecuting, and so he himself converts to that sect. Now, he was obviously quite a charismatic character, as that is when Christianity really started to take off, but he couldn't be everywhere, so some of the churches he established were straying from the path that he had laid out for them, so he would write them letters to correct them. And thus is born Christianity, mostly as is shaped by Paul. I'd actually go so far as to say that Paul was a more important figure in the development of Christianity than Jesus was. As my mythicist friends will happily point out, Jesus existing in the first place isn't even a prerequisite for the development of Christianity. I disagree, but the mythicist position is still more plausible in my mind than one of an actual resurrection.
Also, the first believers were all Jewish, but they started observing Sunday as their principal day of worship rather than the Sabbath, which is Saturday.
This was not a sudden change. In the beginning, the early Christians were indeed Jewish, and as Jews, they continued observing the Sabbath on Saturdays, though they would often hold weekly Sunday meetings at the home of one of their fellow Christians. It wasn't until after the destruction of the temple that the Christians started to more formally separate themselves from the rest of the Jewish community, and that included explanations for why the now destroyed temple was no longer a necessary part of their religion, and part of their explanation for that had them shifting the importance onto Jesus, which also shifted the important day to the day that he rose from the dead. So the shift to Sundays was more a function of the destruction of the temple than it was a powerful indicator that Jesus actually did rise from the dead on a Sunday.
The Lord's Supper took on a greater importance than Passover for them, and baptism took on new meaning.
So a new religion incorporated elements from an older religion, but with some alterations? That's basically the story of every religion. But somehow we're supposed to think that it was special in this instance? That'd be like saying that Mormonism must be correct because the early Mormons were Christians, but they changed some of the traditional Christian beliefs and practices while still leaning heavily on Christianity.
There's no logical reason for them to do any of those things unless they actually saw the risen Christ.
So, are you suggesting that every single early Christian saw the risen Christ personally? Because if there were no reason other than having directly seen the risen Christ for yourself to do any of those things, then in order for Christianity to grow at all, Jesus would have had to have appeared to everyone individually in order to get them to change which day they worshipped on and what they do for Passover. And why did he stop doing that? Wouldn't that still be a good way to gain converts today? Or perhaps there could have been a cultural shift that started with a relatively small number of people who may or may not have really been convinced that they had an encounter with Jesus, and then this cultural pressure is what eventually caused these changes.
But what if Jesus conned everyone? The swoon theory suggests that Jesus didn't die. He just swooned and revived later in the tomb.
Yep.
I'm going to skip this. I don't accept swoon theory, and the way I see it, the only reason it still survives is because it's part of the Muslim tradition. To summarize, the idea is that he didn't die on the cross, he was just severely injured. He then had a couple of days of undisturbed rest in the tomb to recover. This is still more plausible than an actual resurrection, but it does assume a tomb burial, which I don't think was very likely in the first place, and I find it hard to believe that the Romans, who were generally very good at making sure that people died painfully, managed to botch one of their executions badly enough that spending 40 hours on a cold stone slab with no food or water was sufficient medical treatment to allow for a recovery. I mean, given the state of medicine at the time, avoiding medical treatment could save lives, but I don't think it would have in this instance.
And an even weirder theory is that those who claim to have seen the resurrected Christ merely hallucinated. Now, you have to believe here that many people had the same hallucination in different places at different times, in groups of sometimes more than 500, and some had a similar hallucination more than once.
No, that's only what one has to believe if one were to assume that the creed of 1 Corinthians 15 is accurately reporting these events. As mentioned earlier, it could have begun with one single person having a bereavement hallucination, followed by a story that grew over time, as stories often do. Bereavement hallucinations are a normal thing for someone who has suffered a loss to experience, and while one is the minimum required for the beginnings of Christianity, it's not outside the realm of plausibility that 2 or 3 of the disciples had such hallucinations. They could then have interpreted them as Jesus speaking to them from beyond the grave, and as the story spread, new details kept getting added on. Give it a few decades of organic growth through oral retelling, and the stories we ended up with in the Gospels are entirely possible without an actual resurrection.
Right.
Hallucinations don't work that way.
I'm curious what their explanation for the miracle of the sun would be, when thousands of people gathered together and had visions of the Virgin Mary. Pretty sure they're not Catholic, but that one has much better attestation than the 500 witnesses to the resurrection. I'm gonna end it here. They spend the rest of the video talking about the idea that Easter was stolen from the pagans, and while it is possible that some of the Easter traditions do have pagan origins, there's not really a lot of evidence that the celebration itself is taken from the pagans, and the connections that are there are rather tenuous, with a lot of misinformation coming from all sides. I'd rather spend my time focusing on more substantial arguments than that, as the best position that can get someone to is that of some modern Christians that the Easter egg hunts and Easter bunny references should be shunned because of their supposed pagan origin, but the resurrection is still a thing. That's not really a useful position to end up at, so I'll just focus on the resurrection and continue to hide eggs for my kids, regardless of what the origin of such a tradition might have been. If you are interested in the lack of connection between pagan practices and Easter, I'll link to a video by Ocean Keltoy on the subject. He did a great job of explaining just how tenuous that connection is. Also, that Ishtar meme is completely wrong and just needs to die. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Liska de Babbitt, who asks, "What's your opinion of Canada's treatment of First Nations peoples?" My opinion is that it has been and continues to be atrocious. Certainly it's not as bad as it used to be when the residential schools were operating, up until the shockingly recent year of 1996, but not as bad as when we were forcefully separating children from their parents in an act of cultural genocide. It's not exactly a high bar to clear here. And given the recent discourse on residential schools, I'm sure some people will be under the impression that that was a Catholic undertaking. That is not the case. The schools were the government's idea, and the churches that ran the schools, not just the Catholic Church, but also the Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and a few other smaller ones, were contracted by the government to run the schools, so the government paid them for it. The reason the Catholic Church has been receiving all the attention about it is because, as usual for them, they were the last ones to issue an apology out of all the organizations involved, having just done so on April 1st of all days. It was also a bit of a non-apology, where the Pope didn't apologize for the fact that the Catholic Church condoned the running of these schools, but rather he apologized that some people who happened to be Catholic also happened to be involved in the residential schools. So it was a tidy way of getting the spotlight for issuing the apology without actually accepting responsibility as an organization. Sorry, I'm off topic. Yeah, Canadian government isn't great when it comes to their treatment of First Nations. Not by a long shot. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the hallucinations that attest to the existence of my channel. If you'd like to be mistaken for historical fact, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Don't forget to subscribe to The Watering Hole to get my live streams broken down into digestible chunks, and also, The Bible Through a Child's Eyes is coming back. The next one should be up on Sunday, assuming I get my editing done during the week that I was also editing this video, so it's not done yet, but we recorded it and it's a good one. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects like The Watering Hole and my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!